I'd like to introduce Wendy Chisholm. Wendy is our afternoon keynote speaker. She's a web developer, human factors engineer, and co-author of Universal Design for Web Applications, which a few early arrivals should have gotten some free copies of this morning, courtesy of O'Reilly. She was a staff person for the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, for 6 years, where she focused on web content accessibility guidelines. Wendy has also consulted for Microsoft, Google, Adobe, and the American Foundation for the Blind. So Wendy's here to talk about universal design, and let's welcome her.
Thank you. Okay, is this mic on? And can you hear me? Pretty good? All right, I can't hear myself very well. Let me know if I need to talk louder at any point. Well, gosh, I've been having a great time today. You all really know about web standards, it seems like, so I can just kind of get up here and have fun. I don't have to sell you anything today, right? How many people are doing web standards? Know what they are. How many people know the World Wide Web Consortium? Fantastic. How many people know who invented the web and it wasn't Al Gore? Even better. So I'm going to talk a bit today about how my journey to web, and in particular web accessibility. Of course, it will include a little bit about BernersLee, since I did work at the consortium. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things that you all can do, if you're not doing them already. How many people are aware of Section 508? All right. So I will have to sell some of you a little bit today, I think. That's cool. How many people know the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? All right. Good to know. OK. Well, my story with the World Wide Web and accessibility begins with Legos. And so in 1990-ish, I was studying computer science at Elmhurst College, small school outside Chicago. Anyone familiar with Elmhurst College? All right. Yeah, it's a small school outside Chicago. So we get lost in the fray. But at any rate, I was studying computer science and psychology and really interested in how people interact with computers. I'd been programming computers since I was 12. My dad used to work at one of the sites, and so I was always kind of geeking around. So I wanted to figure out how to make these things work for people. And one of my psychology professors asked me to tutor a student in statistics. I said, sure, that sounds cool. And I met the student, and he was blind. I knew nothing about blindness. I have no idea why this teacher asked me to do this. But being curious and full of adventure, I said, why not? And so then I started trying to figure out, well, how am I going to teach someone who's blind about bar graphs and scatter plots and statistical equations and all these things? So we got really creative, and we ended up using Legos to teach him about bar graphs. And I used a pin to poke holes in a piece of paper that had scatter plots on it so he could feel the scatter plot. Now, I don't claim that he did really well in this class, but I learned a lot, and it planted a lot of seeds that I've carried with me and that have really grown and flowered throughout my entire career. It made me realize that, or it actually just got me asking a lot of questions. How could I have used a computer to help him? And so at the time, I had no clue. But I wanted to figure it out. Well, I went on, I graduated. I was a programmer at the Chicago Stock Exchange for a while, and then I was a programmer at the University of Chicago. So hearing a lot of the stories I've heard today about dealing with computer systems in a large university, I was a programmer at, I think it was AIS, Administrative Information Systems at the University of Chicago. And the web was just starting to come out, and so we were trying to figure out how to create this huge data store in such a way that people could get data out of it. And we were trying to connect the grants with the students and the teachers and the faculty, trying to bring all this data together in such a way that people could use it. So we started using the web as an interface for pulling that data. And so obviously that has evolved quite a lot with the stuff that you all are doing now. But it was at the time that I read this really interesting article about a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm moving closer and closer to Minneapolis here, right? His name is Gregg Vanderheiden, and his whole purpose was to create technology for people with disabilities. And I thought that sounded really cool. Fit in with my whole Lego thing. And I ended up getting a master's in industrial engineering, focusing on human factors. And when I started there, this is a lot what the web looked like. Do people remember links? Well, for people who are blind, this was awesome. For the first time, they were able to get news at the same time as everybody else. You didn't have to wait for the newspaper to be brailled. You didn't have to wait for it to be read over the radio. As soon as it was online, you could get it. That was a huge leap forward. It was very empowering, really exciting. And yeah, we were all on this level playing field. Well, soon after, Mark Andreessen introduced the image element and mosaic. And the discussions on the HTML working group at that time were all about, how do we do more than just text? And it was amazing that that one element changed so much about what the web was doing. When Tim first invented the web, it was all about documents and data. And now this is what started moving us towards brochures, right? Brochures. How many people had web brochures for the longest time? How many people still have web brochures? But because of this, all of a sudden, all that textual information was no longer available to people who were blind. All that text in the Mosaic logo is gone, right? And so people who were used to having this information for this brief amount of time, all of a sudden it was gone. And they were kind of back where they were. So in 1994, Gregg started working on these things called the page authoring guidelines or something like that. When I started with him in 1995, I started hacking HTML and just saying, well, if I do this, what's a screen reader going to do? And so how many people are familiar with what a screen reader is? Awesome. For those of you who don't know, it's a piece of software that takes the screen or the text that's on the screen and reads it out loud to someone who's blind or has a reading disability or some other learning disability. So while we were concerned about screen readers, the image element was just a precursor to video and all sorts of other things, like marquee. And so there were lots of issues that we started realizing that we needed to become aware of because of different people's abilities. And then what about preferences? People have different preferences. And so that's one of the things I want to highlight today is that while much of the work that I have done has been based on making the web and the world more accessible for people with disabilities, I want to try to reframe it as we have preferences. How many people use iPhones or Android phones or access the web in some other way than on a laptop? So you have preferences, and oftentimes in those devices, your abilities are constrained. So one thing I try to do is to help people realize that there's no us and them. People with disabilities aren't some group over here that we sometimes think about. We're all human. We all have the right to participate in society. And so why don't we try to think about ways that we can design things just that we're designing for everyone, and that people aren't a special case, it's just all of us. So that's one thing I'll be focusing on today. Okay, so Tim Berners-Lee, everybody's excited that I know him, right? This is a funny photo of him listening to my co-author, Matt May. He looks a little bored, right? I love to laugh at that photo. But the thing about it is that when Tim invented the web, he was thinking about how we can share documents and all of that. But in his book, Weaving the Web, he talks about how the web is just a platform for democracy. It's a platform for connecting with each other. It's a platform for supporting our daily life. And so while a lot of this discussion today has been about HTML and CSS and the things that go into the web, I want to take you back out and help you realize that, I'm sure you all realize, that the web is really about all of us and us connecting. And it's becoming more and more just part of our daily life. It's not something that we go to and sit in front of anymore. It's being integrated, especially with location information and tweeting about all sorts of different things. I mean, this image of a virtual world and our real physical world is blending. And so much of society is blending in with the web. And so again, the web and access to it being a human right and making sure that everyone can participate in our society. And it's just really amazing that Tim was thinking about that from the very beginning. And he truly is a visionary. I think one of the most interesting things, one of the most interesting discussions that I had with him was, in Hawaii, we used to have these team days. We'd get together, the entire team. There were 60 of us. We lived all over the world. And so we'd get together, hang out, play games, icebreakers. So over lunch one day, I'm like, Tim, how do you do it? I mean, how do you manage to do all the stuff you do and to have this vision? And just tell me, what's your secret? And he said, I learned to say no. And I think that's interesting in that learning to focus on what's important and kind of moving all this stuff, focusing on what's really important. For me, that's making sure that we have an inclusive universe, that the world involves everybody. So one aspect of that is design and how important design is in either creating barriers or creating connection or the space for connection. One of my favorite quotes is, "Stairs make a building inaccessible, not a wheelchair." And why is that such an important quote to me? Because, I've been working in this space since 1995. It's been my job to travel the world to understand how different cultures approach disability, how accessibility issues differ between cultures. And the one thing that I've seen that we all share is this idea that there's just not this value on people with disabilities, unfortunately, and there's not this focus on including them from the beginning. And so it's through design. I mean, it's so often we assume that it's the wheelchair, it's the person's fault, when in fact, if we design society differently, more people will be able to participate. So one of the things that is fun in this area, and there are a lot of things that are fun. I wouldn't still be doing this if this weren't a really awesome area to be involved in. One of the coolest things is when you look at the history of technologies developed for people with disabilities, you see technologies that have changed the world. So, once again, how many people use an iPhone or an Android phone? Do all of you realize that you're using technologies that were developed for people with disabilities? How many people realize that? So let me show you. Screen magnification, right? How often do you pinch and zoom? How many people use magnification? Even if you don't have an iPhone or you have, how many of you use Macs? Do you all realize that magnification is built in? It's one of the things that I've seen several presenters using here today, because as an audience, you have low vision, right? There are times when there is text that's on the screen that you can't see, and if the presenter is smart, they know how to bump up the font size so that you can see it. Hopefully you'll be able to see all the text on my slides today. But if you can't, I could use a screen magnifier. So screen magnification, developed for people with low vision. Started out as magnifying, the magnifiers that you use with your hands. But in the early 80s, these got put onto computers, right? And now they're on iPhones. And it's an integral part of the iPhone and the Android phone experience. How many people use word prediction? How many people use Word? And you get checks for spelling errors. How many people use an on-screen keyboard? Right. So again, these are all technologies developed for people with disabilities. So the on-screen keyboard and the word prediction, those were created for people with physical disabilities who could not physically type characters on the keyboard. And so word prediction went right along with it, because typing using an on-screen keyboard when you only have one method of getting to each of the keys takes a really, really, really long time. And so the on-screen or the word prediction helped make that process faster and easier. And now they're in all of our technologies. So developing tools for people with disabilities is usually extremely innovative, because when you develop something for a limited ability, anyone else who has more than that ability, their abilities are immediately pumped up. It's just tools, right? That's what tools do. We have shovels so we can dig holes deeper. We have cars so we can drive around the city faster. We have word prediction so we can type faster. And so these are all just tools. And if you want to be innovative, you can look at people with disabilities. So one of my favorite movies is Robots. How many people have seen the movie Robots? Okay, so it's about an inventor, really cute movie. And one of the lines in there I like most is, see a need, fill a need, right? And that's kind of my philosophy on all of this. And I just went to a conference that focused on technology for people with disabilities, and I specifically went around looking for what are we going to be using tomorrow. And I found some really neat stuff. So anyway, it's exciting, it's cool. This is the future. It always has been. Even when you start looking at mobile development, when you look at localization, when you look at SEO, they can all point back to accessibility. All the stuff that we've been talking about for 15 years, all these other disciplines are starting to talk about now. You know, accessibility, you usually have faster download times. With the way that you're coding up your markup, you get better SEO results. So there's just always these benefits. It's amazing. I just don't understand why more people don't do it. It's cool. You're helping people, and it just makes everything better. So I hope that but I think the problem is that there's a stigma associated with disability, right? People don't want to associate with people with disabilities. And there's a need to change that in our culture. And so I hope that I can shine some light on that and help you realize that there's a gold mine here of really cool stuff and cool people who use this stuff. Now, one of my other favorite stories, which I tend to embellish quite a lot, is about the typewriter. So in Italy, there was a countess and an inventor, and he wanted to receive letters from her, but she was blind. So what did he do? He worked on a typewriter so that she could write letters independently to him. I like to think they were love letters. I have no proof that they were, but I think that's a beautiful story if it's true. Again, innovation for people with disabilities can really change how the rest of us are doing things. It's just tools. It's leveraging abilities. It's focusing on the ability that someone does have, and then expanding and building tools to fill that. So the other thing, because it's a tool, is going to broaden your audience, right? People with disabilities are the third largest market segment in the United States. Over the next 5 years, that's going to represent over $5 trillion worth of spending. Why wouldn't you go after that market? And the thing is, that's the third. The first is baby boomers. The second are seniors. Who is not aging in this room? I want your secret. Right. So seniors, baby boomers will be seniors soon enough. They will become the first market segment. And most of and the thing is, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but basically, as you age, things don't always work like they used to, right? Your eyes, your ears, your brain. A lot of the things that we do for people with disabilities are the things that you all are going to be using, and you're going to be hoping were built into these websites that you're developing now in the very near future. So, makes a lot of sense today, makes even more sense for you tomorrow. The other thing is, the things that we do that were, again, designed for people with disabilities will help all of us. So while the curb cut is designed for someone using a wheelchair, it's used by people with roller suitcases, people pushing strollers, bicycles. You know, my friend has a little boat thing that she hauls around. She has a kayak, right? She uses these things. The other part about it is that it's so important to include this from the beginning. So curb cuts, if you install them when you install a new sidewalk, there's not an additional cost. If you install the curb and then later have to retrofit it, there's an additional cost. And so that's one of the reasons I know that people are afraid of accessibility is because of additional cost. The thing is, if most of you are already doing web standards, and if you're not, this is another good reason to be doing them, building in accessibility from the beginning is just another part of the process, and it shouldn't cost any more. And that's another reason, I would like to just hop on with Christina and say, yes, do content strategy from the beginning. make accessibility part of the content strategy as well, right? Accessibility from the beginning would be awesome and end up saving you money in the end. It's like if you catch a bug early in the development process, the quicker you catch a bug, the less costly that bug is. And so if you look at accessibility as a bug that hasn't been fixed, catch it earlier in the process rather than later. Another good story is OXO. How many people use the OXO grip kitchen gadgets? Okay, this is another great story because this was designed by someone with arthritis. So the little tiny kitchen tools that used to be out there really started to hurt. And so part of their slogan was, why should kitchen appliances hurt? They shouldn't. Make them bigger and they won't hurt. But now they're selling to everybody. This isn't an accessibility aid. This isn't for people with disabilities. This is for everyone. And that's the really beauty. That's one of the most beautiful things about universal design is that it really helps everyone. And there are all these other side effects, like I mentioned, SEO, mobile, all these things become so much easier and just become part of the process. And I already talked a bit about the market segments. I also just want to throw out a couple more numbers. There are 52 million Americans in the United States who have identified themselves as having a disability. But how many people don't identify? I mean, no one wants to be called disabled, right? They don't. I mean, how many people know who Amy Mullins is? She's a runner. She was on the cover of ESPN. She's done some amazing TED Talks. If people are into the TED Talks, and she recently did one for TED Med, where she looked at the word disability. She looked at, in a thesaurus, for what words are associated with it. You know, broken, damaged, all these very negative things. So no one wants to be considered disabled. Now, in the disability rights movement, you know, what is our black is beautiful, or we can do it? You know, are we going to try to reclaim the word disability, or are we going to try and find something new? I don't know. But as it is right now, there's a lot of stigma associated with disability. So even though the numbers say there's 52 million Americans and 20% of Americans have a disability, I suspect that number is lower than it actually is, because I think also a lot of people may not be diagnosed. And also, if you look worldwide, there are 650 million people worldwide. So, now another aspect of what I'm really concerned about is not just making things functionally accessible for people with disabilities. So those people of you who raised your hand about knowing what a screen reader is, how many of you enjoyed that experience? Exactly, no one's raising their hand. It's a pain in the butt. How many people use Emacs? How many people know what Emacs is? Okay. Okay, there you go. So why don't you use Emacs? It's a pain in the butt to learn. The cognitive load from remembering all those commands, none of you do it, right? I'm sure there are other reasons why you may not use Emacs, but think about when we went from DOS to the GUI and everything became point and click, everyone started using computers. I mean, that was a huge, all of a sudden you really could have a computer on every desk, because now there wasn't this need to memorize all these archaic commands. Screen readers are still there. To use a screen reader, you basically have to learn an equivalent of Emacs. You boot up. That just reminds me of Wall-E again, right? Okay, so you basically have to use an Emacs-like interface. And so many people never really go through that full learning curve. So I work at the University of Washington, and one of the programs I work on is access computing. Part of our goal in that project is to get students with disabilities through high school and into college, help them with that transition, and then from college into careers. And we're working very hard to get them into STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And part of the reason we want to do that is that we know that if people with disabilities are on the teams that are creating these new technologies, the new technologies are more likely to be accessible, and they're more likely to be innovative. Imagine if you've spent your whole life trying to figure out how to get around barriers. You're going to be a really creative thinker. You're going to have a very different point of view on the world. And the things and the ideas and innovations you come up with are going to be really new and interesting. And it's just a good thing to do. Okay, so getting back to beauty, function, and this equation up here, beauty, function, and power. How does this all work? Well, screen readers are functional, but they're a pain in the ass. So no one is really excited to use them. They're excited because it gets them information and you can become part of society, but they're a pain in the butt to use. However, if we were to design things so that they weren't only accessible, but they were beautiful, people could take pride in those tools. I mean, how many people love your Mac or your iPhone? Because it's a beautiful, because it's a beautiful piece of technology, right? You like to use it. You're excited to get the new one. Well, here is Amy Mullins. I mentioned her earlier. Now, I know this isn't the best picture, but bear with me. It looks like she's wearing a pair of brown leather boots, right? She doesn't have legs below the knee. Those are actually wooden legs. She spoke at TED a few years ago and said, hey, designers, make me some legs, beautiful legs, get creative. And one person came up with these. And I mean, they're beautiful. The carving is intricate. It's flowers. I mean, it looks like something you would find in a cathedral in Europe or something like that. I mean, they're just beautiful and incredibly functional. And then look at the guy behind her on the climbing wall. How many people rock climb? Right on. I do too. Now, look at how tiny those holds are, right? What is that, like a 5'10", 11C, something like that? But because of the way that his prosthetics have been designed, he's probably going to be able to climb that way better than I can, and just from that alone. So he can take pride in that. He can go enjoy and have, do all sorts of cool things. So not only do I want you to make things accessible, I want you to make things beautiful. I want you to empower people. And a lot of that is through beauty and design. So don't create barriers, create connection, and make it beautiful. That's all you got to do. Another great story is eyeglasses, right? So in the 1930s, when eyeglasses were first coming out, I guess, they were skin-colored. People were ashamed of having to wear glasses, much like people are ashamed to use wheelchairs today, in some cases. But now, how many of you are wearing glasses right now? And how many of you don't even have a prescription and you're just wearing them because they look cool? Right? They've become a fashion accessory. What if canes became that cool? I mean, they used to be, right? Way back in the day, top hat and cane. How can we do that again? How can we make this stuff beautiful, functional, cool, and empower people? It's a real opportunity here. Lots of room for innovation. This is a dance troupe in Seattle. And speaking of beauty, the moves that she can do in the wheelchair are unlike anything you've seen someone do with legs. It's really, really cool. Beauty, empowerment, art, design. It's all linked. It's all important. Well, so how can you do this? I'm going to give you just a few basic tidbits here. And these are based on the principles in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, I know poor is a poor mnemonic, right? Because I don't want you to make your websites poor. I'm hoping that you pour on the beauty, and you pour on the connection, and you pour on the empowerment. That's what I'm going for here, right? So perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Those are the 4 principles in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The neat thing about that, though, is I think that really applies to anything that you're designing. And I'm going to go through these real quickly. I hope. Oh, perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. At the end, I'm going to have you chant that, right? Perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. Okay, text equivalence. How many people are familiar with alt text? So how come more pages don't have alt text? Why? Why is that the easiest thing to do, but one of the first things to overlook? And it helps with SEO, right? I mean, there's so many benefits. It helps if people are using a mobile device and they're not downloading the images, right? Anyway, now the main thing to remember about alt text or text equivalence is that there's kind of 2 categories. Very broadly, there are many others. But very broadly, there are 2. One, things that provide information, images that provide information, and images that don't. Images that provide information, the text equivalent should represent the information that that image is providing. If it's not providing information, just put alt equals quote, quote, and someone can ignore it. So just like someone visually is going to ignore it, a screen reader can ignore it too. And captions, right? So basically, this whole principle, perceivable, is about making things available to someone's senses. So if someone can't see, they need to be able to hear or feel the information. If someone can't hear, they need to be able to see or feel the information. If someone cannot see or hear, they need to be able to feel the information. Now the only thing that you need to worry about is just making sure that if you have visual information, it's in text. And if you have auditory information, it's in text. And then the assistive technologies will do all the other work for you. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about assistive technologies today. That's a whole nother experience. That's a whole nother lecture I could get into. I'll mention a few of them in a moment. But that's one thing to keep in mind. Text is king is one of the things that people say, right? And with captions, it's getting easier and easier to caption video. How many people have heard about Google's automatic captioning? So basically what they've done is Google Voice was a way to use speech recognition, right? So if you had Google Voice, you got a voicemail, they send you an email that would have the text of what the person had just said. It's amazing that they can do that. But how many people have actually read what comes out of Google Voice, right? There's still some work to do, unfortunately. But the cool thing about it is that at least it generates a transcript that then you can go back and fix. And if you have a transcript, Google can automatically sync it as long as your transcript includes the time codes. And there are more and more organizations that are providing that service. And it's not really that expensive. Castingwords.com, I think it's $1 a minute. And then there's .sub. So you could do crowdsourcing. You can put up a video, and they have an interface, and anyone can include the captions. And the cool thing about .sub is that their whole thing is that they're providing captions so that your video can be looked at in other languages. Well, that's the thing that Google has really caught on to well also, is that there's also automatic translation. So as soon as you get your video captioned, it's automatically being translated into other languages. Again, there are some quirks there. But the savings, the ease, is incredibly awesome. And so it's very exciting to see Google have such a commitment to making this technology available and accessible. Now, speaking of Google, one of the quotes from our book that I absolutely love is that Google is a billionaire user who is deaf and blind with tens of millions of friends. Right? If Google can find your content, then most people can, with no matter your ability or your preference, can use it. Right? If Google can find it. And the other thing that I heard yesterday is Google is now looking at download time as a means of determining PageRank. So you also want to cut down the speed, which means all those unnecessary graphics, all that table layout, you may want to think about what that does to your search scores. All right, perceivable, color. So when I was working on my slides, I wanted to make sure that the color scheme I had was going to be high enough contrast. There's a tool out there, it's free, it's called Color Analyzer. I just ran it through just to make sure, because I know that 20% of people, 20% of men are colorblind. And I also know a lot of people don't perceive color very well. And I also didn't know, how well the contrast was going to be on the screen. Computers are different, projection screens are different. So I tried to make my slides as readable as possible. Now, have they been easy to read? Was I successful? Okay, cool. But it's an important thing when you're designing content. Okay, that was perceivable, operable. So a lot of websites assume that you have a mouse, right? If you want to pop up a menu, they're only going to look for on mouse over, hover. You can't activate some menus any other way. Well, there are a lot of people out there who don't use a mouse. How many people use an iPhone? Right, there's no mouse. So, but think about all the other people. So people who use screen readers, people are using speech input, who may be using a mouse, directing it with their voice. But don't always assume a mouse. We like to say you want to be input device agnostic, right? Don't assume a mouse. And so these are up here to represent some of the assistive technologies. On the lower right is a dynamic braille display. So someone who is used to reading braille, there's all these little pins that pop up, create braille cells for them. And just using the cord, they are able to drive their computer. On the upper right is what's called a head tracker. Someone can wear a silver dot on the middle of their head, and as they move their head around, it is going to move a mouse, but they aren't going to have, and then they're going to be using an on-screen keyboard. The headphones represent a screen reader, and the microphone and the earpiece represent speech input. And these are just a small collection of some of the assistive technologies that are out there. So operable is all about input methods. And a very important part of input is navigating through the content and finding what you want, getting to where you want, and selecting it. So on this page, what is the structure? And on this case, it doesn't matter if you can read or not the actual text, because hopefully visually you can see that there are groups of information. There's a yellow bar which indicates visually that that's a new section. So one of the things we try to do when we create the structure of a web page or web application, the importance of the semantic HTML, is to think about the design, the visual design of a page, and what is the intended path through this design. What are the groupings? Where are the headings? And then thinking about how to emulate that experience using the page structure. How are you going to guide somebody through that structure? So where are your headings? Where are the links? What are the groupings? And that's an interesting part about HTML5. So I'm on one of the task forces within the HTML5 working group. And so I've been in HTML5 Super Friend and stuff like that. So I'm excited about HTML5. And the landmarks and the structure and all the semantics are going to be great for accessibility. I have a few concerns about some of the other elements that I'll get to later. But semantics and semantic HTML is important. So for example, if we look at what the actual structure of this page is, each major section has a heading. Now, someone who's using a screen reader, or someone who's using just a keyboard to navigate through the page, someone who may be visual but may have a learning disability, so they may be using a screen reader, or someone who has a physical disability, so they're just using the keyboard instead of a mouse, can navigate by headings, right? They can navigate the structure. And so you can go heading to heading to heading, find the heading you want, and drill down and find the links then that you want, or read the content that you want to read. So it's similar to the visual experience. You scan, find what you're looking for, and dig in a little bit deeper. Perceivable, operable, understandable. Understandable. Now this is one of the hardest ones. And when we were working, so I was editor of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines throughout its whole thing, and on 2.0 for a lot of the time. And the working group really struggled with understandable, because the first two, perceivable and operable, are about getting information into someone's brain. Once the information is in the brain, how can you help someone understand it? And so how do you write well? Well, that debate's been going on for how many thousands of years? So we couldn't put it was very difficult for us to put anything in there. In WCAG 1.0, we had a guideline in there that said write simply and clearly. A lot of teachers loved that, but anyone who wanted to test their site to determine if they had written well, there was no good test of it. So that was one of the frustrating things, is we had to pull a lot of those ideas, a lot of that instruction out. But making things consistent, predictable, reliable is a really good start, especially as you're making widgets and web applications and making sure things work similarly across pages. The final one is robust. So Jeffrey Zeldman talks a lot about future-proofing, right? If you're following web standards today, hopefully no matter what browser comes out tomorrow, what device comes out tomorrow, what assistive technology comes out tomorrow, your content will continue to work. And so one of the ways to do that is to follow web standards. And that means validating your code. And that gets you a lot of the way to accessibility. And hopefully that will continue. I have to say one of the things that's kind of scary about HTML5 is that, so in HTML4, if you don't have an alt attribute on an image element, your code doesn't validate. In HTML5, There are cases where you don't have to have an alt attribute on your image element, and you could still validate. I'm a little scared about that one. And speaking of HTML5, there are lots of really amazing problems here that are very cool engineering problems. Like I said, I started out as a computer scientist. I'm an industrial engineer. These are really cool engineering problems. And if you think so too, you can get involved. So Canvas, how many people have heard about HTML5 Canvas? How many people have seen the cool demos here? Yeah, it's totally cool. It's totally inaccessible too. So to me, it looks like Flash in 1998. You know, people are going to be doing a lot of the same things with it. Again, totally cool. I do not want to stifle innovation at all. That is not my purpose. My purpose here is to inspire you to figure out how to make this accessible. We have in the task force some people coming up with some great ideas, but to me it really sounds like a hack. But don't tell them I told you that. What they want to do is create a shadow DOM that's going to hide behind a canvas to make it accessible. The accessibility will not be built in. Now, hopefully, any of the libraries that you're using to generate Canvas will include accessibility. A lot of the AJAX libraries, JavaScript libraries, include accessibility, so I hope that trend continues, and I hope that spreads. There's a lot of libraries that don't have it yet. But that's just something to be aware of, right? And there's some other issues like that in HTML5. So how do we make this work, right? I know all of you probably have plenty to do already. You don't need another thing to learn, right? But I beg you, please. You're doing, it's an amazing thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It can get you more customers. More customers means more money. Following standards in general will help you have easier to maintain code, easier to change your design. And really, I want you to think about how do we include accessibility at the alpha release. If Canvas, when they had first started thinking about it, if someone had been there saying, hey, what about accessibility? Maybe we wouldn't be having to retrofit Canvas. Like, we're already having to retrofit HTML5, and it's not even done yet. You know, all the browsers support HTML5, or Canvas as it is, except for IE. So how are we going to do that? So I don't have all the answers, right? I don't know how to make it cheap and easy for you. I can tell you that it's a really awesome thing. I can tell you that it's a great field to be in. I don't know how to make it cheap and easy. That's something I'm still working on. But I'm willing to work with you, and I'm willing to help you, and let's figure out a way together how to change the world. I mean, that's really what it's all about. Another thing I can encourage you to do is work with people with disabilities. There are amazing communities out there. Disaboom is one of them. BBC Ouch is another one. People with disabilities writing their stories, sharing their experiences in the world. Connect with them. That's what the web is all about. You can also hire people with disabilities. I mean, I don't see anyone here with a visible disability, and many of you probably have invisible disabilities. But why aren't there more people with disabilities here? One of the key phrases in the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And unfortunately, we're kind of doing without us right now. So get people with disabilities involved. I have 12 interns that I've hired, or that I've taught 5 days last year on how to make accessible websites. You want to hire them? I would absolutely love that. They know what they're doing. They're good students. So inclusive design. Design is a key factor here in creating barriers or creating and allowing and supporting connection. And just imagine, what if we all focused on what we were able to do instead of what we can't? What if we focused on how similar we are instead of how different we are? Or what if we did focus on the differences but not see that as a bad thing, but see that as inspiration? So imagine if canes and wheelchairs and prosthetics were as fashionable as eyeglasses. What would our world look like? I think it would look really awesome. And I would love to see that happen. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.